The morning I got the call about my promotion, I was standing in my kitchen in mismatched socks, burning toast and laughing so hard I nearly dropped my phone. I had absolutely no idea that 6 weeks later, my mother-in-law would be standing in that same kitchen, uninvited, unannounced, armed with a printed spreadsheet detailing exactly how I should spend every dollar of my brand new $200,000 salary. That spreadsheet had a line item for her mortgage. It had a column titled Extended Family Support Structure and a note at the very bottom, scrawled in the handwriting of the man I had married, that read, "Carol has agreed to oversee discretionary allocation." I stood in my own home, the home I had bought, whose mortgage carried only my name. And I read those words 3 times before my vision began to blur at the edges. It was mid-October, and the light that morning had the particular quality that only comes in autumn, low and golden, arriving through the east-facing windows at a long, shallow angle and pooling on the oak floorboards in rectangles of amber. I had woken before Jason and come downstairs to make coffee the way I always did. 2 scoops of the medium roast blend from a small Oregon farm, water brought just to the edge of boiling, 4 full minutes in the French press. While it steeped, I stood at the counter with my palms flat on the cool stone and watched the light shift outside the window. The apple tree in the backyard still had most of its leaves, yellowing at the edges, and a few had fallen overnight onto the grass. I could smell the coffee blooming, rich and nutty and deeply ordinary, and I breathed it in and thought, as I often did in those early mornings, I built this life, this kitchen, this quiet. I built it. Our house was a 1920s craftsman bungalow 20 minutes from the tech campus where I worked. I had provided the down payment, $43,000 saved over 6 years of deliberate, sometimes painful discipline, and my income alone had qualified us for the mortgage. Jason was building his freelance photography business at the time, and while he was genuinely talented, it was still finding its footing. We had agreed, with the easy generosity of 2 people deeply in love, that I would carry us financially while he established himself. It had not felt like sacrifice. It had felt like partnership. I knew every creak of every stair in that house. I had spent 3 weekends regrouting the kitchen tiles. I had painted the trim in the living room myself in a warm off-white that took 4 coats to get right. At 32, I had worked for everything I had, and I was not embarrassed to know it. I'd been at the company for 6 years, starting as a junior product manager, organized, invisible, responsible, and working through 3 promotions, 2 brutal performance reviews, and 1 reorganization that had eliminated 12 people on my original team. When Patricia, my manager, called that October morning, I answered on the first ring. "You're our new director of product," she said, without greeting or preamble. "The offer letter goes out this morning. Congratulations." I made a sound that was not a word. My free hand gripped the counter. I was grinning so hard my face ached. The salary was $205,000 base, with bonuses that could bring total compensation close to $260,000 in a strong year. More than I had ever earned. More than either of my parents had earned in a year. When Jason came downstairs, squinting with his hair pressed flat on one side, I told him, and he crossed the kitchen in 3 long steps and picked me up off the floor and spun me around, and we were both laughing, and I remember thinking with complete uncomplicated certainty, this is what happiness feels like, right here. I wish I had looked more carefully at his face when he set me down. His smile had a tightness at its edges. When I said the number out loud, something moved behind his eyes, quick and dark and quickly gone, like a shadow crossing the bottom of a clear pond. I noticed it the way you notice something in your peripheral vision that disappears when you turn to look directly. I filed it under "he's overwhelmed. This is a big moment," and poured him a cup of coffee, and we talked about where to celebrate dinner, and everything felt perfectly, completely normal. It was not. Carol knew within the week. Carol was Jason's mother. 61 years old, small and precise in her movements, with short silver hair kept carefully styled, and a wardrobe of blazers in muted colors she wore with the regularity of a uniform. She had retired from school administration, which meant she had spent 4 decades being the person who decided what the rules were and enforced them with a smile that made the enforcement feel inevitable. She lived 40 minutes away in the house where Jason had grown up, and she smelled of a floral perfume I had never been able to identify. Something between gardenias and something sharper underneath, medicinal almost, that lingered in rooms for hours after she left. Since I had married Jason, she had been what I could only describe as persistently present. She called him every day, sometimes twice. She had opinions about our furniture, our diet, our neighborhood, the grocery store we used, the brand of olive oil worth spending more on. Her warmth was never spontaneous. It was deployed. It appeared when it was useful. From the beginning, she asked questions about my work with an attentiveness I first read as interest and later understood as something more systematic. How many hours did I work? Did I have equity? Was it vested? Were my bonuses guaranteed or performance-based? I mentioned the pattern to Jason once carefully. He laughed. "She's just interested, babe. You know how she is." I did know how she was. That was exactly what I was trying to tell him. She came for dinner 3 days after I accepted the offer. Jason had suggested it, said she would want to celebrate. She brought her lamb stew, the kind that took all day and smelled of rosemary and red wine, and for the first hour everything was cordial and pleasant. Then she asked about the salary. I told her. She set her fork down with a small, careful click and looked at me with an expression not of surprise, but of confirmation, a suspicion verified. "My goodness," she said. Her mouth curved upward in a smile that did not involve her eyes. "That is quite a lot of money. You must be so proud." Jason reached across the table and squeezed my hand, and I held on to the warmth of it and told myself her odd, flat response was just social awkwardness about discussing money. I told myself this the whole drive home. The question started 3 weeks later, in layers, the way sediment accumulates. Carol began calling more often. She began stopping by with small, plausible justifications. She'd been in the neighborhood. She had a cutting from her Japanese maple. She was dropping something off for Jason. One gray Tuesday afternoon, over cups of tea at my kitchen table, she asked about the mortgage. She framed it as concern about interest rates. I told her we were comfortable, that the mortgage was well within my income, that we had reserves. She nodded and sipped her tea, and her eyes moved slowly around my kitchen in a way I recognized later as inventory, and dismissed then as nothing. Then, on a Wednesday evening in early November, I came downstairs to ask Jason about dinner and heard his voice from the living room, low and careful. He was on the phone, his back to the hallway, his shoulders hunched in the posture of someone trying to make themselves smaller than their own conversation. "Yeah, she gets it quarterly," he said. A pause. Significant. "I'll find out the exact breakdown." Another pause. Longer. I could hear Carol's voice on the other end, too quiet to make out words. "I know, Mom," Jason said. "I know." I stepped into the doorway, and he turned, and for one fraction of a second, his face was entirely unfamiliar. The face of someone caught in something they had not decided how to explain. Then it rearranged itself, and he smiled and said, "Hey, Mom says hi," and suggested we order Thai food, and I stood there with a cold, formless unease below my sternum and thought, I am making something out of nothing. I noticed things in the days that followed, financial conversations that stopped before they fully started, a discussion about opening a joint investment account that trailed into silence, then a subject change so smooth it took me a minute to register what had happened. Carol, on her next visit, pausing in the doorway of my home office and surveying my desk with a slow, deliberate gaze before saying, almost to herself, "What a lot of space for one person." I told myself I was tired. I told myself the new role was demanding and my nervous system was producing false positives. I told myself that Carol was Carol and Jason was Jason, and nothing was wrong. Nothing was wrong. And then I came home early on a Thursday afternoon in November because a water main break near campus had sent everyone home at 3 o'clock. I pulled into my driveway and saw Carol's beige sedan at the curb. I let myself in through the front door. The kitchen was empty. The hallway smelled of Carol's perfume, that floral and something underneath smell, which meant she had been here long enough for it to settle. I stood still and listened and heard voices from Jason's editing office at the back of the house, the door partly open. Carol's voice was crisp and certain. Jason's was lower. I walked toward them without deciding to. I stopped outside the door. "She won't fight it," Carol was saying with the confidence of someone narrating an outcome they consider already secured. Not once it's framed as a family decision. You know how she is. She wants to keep the peace. If you present it correctly, Mom. Jason's voice was strained. "I don't know if this is Jason." Her tone cut flat and clean. "We have had this conversation. You have an obligation to this family, and what she earns in part because of the stability you provide. That contribution has value. It deserves formal recognition. I have already spoken with Gerald about the documentation." Gerald was their family attorney. I pushed the door open. They were standing at Jason's desk, both bent over a sheaf of papers. Carol had a pen in her hand. Jason straightened the moment the door moved, and the color left his face so completely and rapidly that he looked overexposed, like a photograph held too long in the light. Carol turned more slowly, her expression moving through surprise, then calculation, then something that might have been alarm, before settling into the smooth, practiced blankness of someone executing a prepared response. "Sarah," she said, "you're home early." I walked forward and picked up the papers from the desk. The first page was dense legal text, formatted with deliberate formality. My eyes moved down it quickly, finding anchor points. My name, Jason's name, the phrase financial arrangement agreement, and the words party of the second part agrees to allocate no less than 30% of gross annual compensation to a jointly managed household account, oversight of which shall be determined by mutual agreement of the parties and their designated financial advisor. My hands were already shaking when I turned to the second page. The second page was the spreadsheet, my projected salary at the top, in bold, deductions for mortgage, utilities, a household maintenance category significantly higher than what we actually spent, and beneath a header reading extended family support structure, a line for Carol's monthly mortgage payment, listed as a fact of our financial life, a line for an elder care reserve for a 61-year-old woman in good health who had recently mentioned planning a trip to Portugal, And at the bottom, in handwriting I would have known anywhere, in blue ink that had bled slightly at the edges, Carol has agreed to oversee discretionary allocation. The room tilted. I am not speaking metaphorically. The room actually seemed to shift. The glass walls suddenly too close and too bright, Carol's perfume dense and suffocating in the enclosed space, the hum of Jason's computer abruptly very loud. I could feel my pulse in my throat, in my temples, at the tips of my fingers where they gripped the papers. I looked at the words in my husband's handwriting, and something in my chest went very quiet. The way things go quiet just before they break. "What?" I said, my voice low and completely flat. "Is this?" Carol opened her mouth immediately, smoothly, the speed of it confirming she'd prepared for exactly this. "Sweetheart," she said, moving one step toward me, her voice warm and measured and infuriating in its composure. "I know this looks alarming. Let me explain. It really isn't what you're thinking. Don't." The word came out before I had decided to say it. Single and flat, and with enough force that Carol stopped mid-step. "Don't call me sweetheart, and don't tell me what I'm thinking." I looked at Jason. He had not looked up from the floor. He was standing with his arms slightly away from his body, the posture of someone who doesn't know what to do with their hands because every available option feels incriminating. He looked exhausted. He looked hollowed out. He looked like someone who had walked step by careful step into something, telling himself at each step that it was fine, until he arrived somewhere he could never have described as his destination from the beginning. "Jason," I said, "look at me." He looked up. His eyes were the eyes of someone caught doing something they knew was wrong, who had no defense they genuinely believed in. He did not look villainous. He looked like someone whose secret had grown heavier than expected, who was almost relieved to put it down, even though this was the worst possible way of putting it down. "How long?" I asked. He said nothing. "How long has she been planning this? Sarah?" "How long, Jason?" He exhaled. The sound was the sound of something structural giving way. "A few months," he said, barely audible. "After the promotion, she brought it up. She wanted to think through how to..." "To what?" I kept my voice level with effort. "She wanted to think through how to take my money, and you sat down with her and helped her draft a legal document. You went to Gerald." I held up the papers. "Did you sign this?" The pause before he answered lasted 4 full seconds. I counted. "Not yet," he said. "Not yet. No, of course not. Not Sarah, I would never do that to you. Not yet." As if the signing were simply pending, as if the question were still open, as if the only thing standing between me and a legally binding document was time, and nothing more fundamental than that. I set the papers down on the desk with great deliberate care, because if I did not do this carefully, I was going to do something irreversible, and I was not ready yet. I needed to think. I needed to be somewhere that was not this room, with its glass walls and its smell of someone else's perfume, and the two people who had been building something in secret while I was building a career I thought we shared. "I need both of you," I said, with a precision that cost me something, "to leave my house." Carol made a small sound, half protest. "Sweetheart, let's all take a breath and... This is my house." Very quiet, very clear. My name is the only name on the deed. I bought it. I pay the mortgage, and I am asking you, for the last time, to leave it. They left. Carol gathered her blazer and her purse. with the composed, unhurried dignity of someone who considers retreat a tactical decision rather than a defeat. She paused in the doorway of the sunroom and looked back at me. One long, measuring look, the kind that takes inventory and files the result. And then she was gone. Her perfume stayed behind as it always did. Jason followed her without speaking, without meeting my eyes, and I heard the front door close, and then the sound of Carol's engine starting at the curb, and then Jason's car, and then silence. I sat down on the floor of his editing office with my back against the desk. I don't know how long I sat there. The gray November light moved slowly across the glass walls, thickening toward evening. The apple tree in the backyard stood bare against the pale sky. I held the spreadsheet in my lap and read every line of it again, slowly this time, without the shock distorting my vision. And what I found, when I could see it clearly, was worse than the anger had allowed me to understand in the first minutes. Because the document was not rough. It was not a brainstorm or a draft or the kind of impulsive, half-formed plan that someone makes in frustration and abandons. It was clean and specific and structured, and it had clearly been through at least one revision. The elder care reserve had a compounding clause. The household maintenance allocation was tied to a price index. Someone, Gerald presumably, had made sure the language was durable. This had taken months. This had taken deliberate, sustained effort, and Jason had been part of that effort. And every morning I had come downstairs to make coffee in my kitchen, every time I had reached for his hand across a restaurant table, every conversation we had about the future, our future. He had been carrying this alongside it, parallel and hidden and growing. I got up when the room was fully dark and the cold had seeped in from the glass walls and settled into my shoulders. I went to the kitchen and turned on the light and stood at the counter and looked at the familiar surfaces of my ordinary life. The French press, the stack of cookbooks with their spines cracked at the recipes I used most often, the ceramic bowl on the counter where we kept keys and coins and small pieces of the daily residue of being alive together. I thought about how completely I had trusted this life, how unexamined that trust had been, not naive. I had not been naive in any other area of my existence, but specifically, deliberately unguarded with the people I had chosen. I had thought choosing someone meant extending to them a kind of structural faith. I had been wrong about what that meant for Jason. My phone was on the counter. I picked it up and called my father. He answered on the second ring. My father, whose name is Robert and who has never in 64 years wasted a word he didn't mean, listened without interrupting while I told him everything. When I finished, there was a pause of perhaps 5 seconds, and then he said, "Have you touched anything in that office since they left?" I said no. He said, "Good, don't. I'm calling Daniel tonight." Daniel was his college roommate who had spent 30 years practicing family law in our state. I had met him at Christmas dinners. I had not, until that moment, fully appreciated the particular value of that connection. "Dad," I said. "I know," he said quietly. The way parents say, "I know," when they mean something larger than agreement. "Come stay here tonight. You shouldn't be alone in that house." I packed a bag. I took from the sunroom the spreadsheet and the legal document. Both pages, handled carefully by their edges, as my father had asked, placed in a manila envelope I found in Jason's filing cabinet. I took photographs of every page with my phone before I sealed it, and I sent those photographs to my own email and to my father's. Then I walked out of my house, set the alarm, and drove to my parents' home. And I did not cry during the drive, which surprised me. The feeling in my chest was not grief yet. It was something harder and more angular. It was the particular sensation of a decision forming. Jason called 11 times that night. I let each call go to voicemail and read the transcripts in the morning, sitting at my parents' kitchen table with my mother's coffee, which was too strong in a way I had always loved. The messages began with explanation and moved through apology and arrived, by the 11th call, at something approaching genuine distress. His voice thinner and higher than I was used to, stripped of the ease that was usually its texture. He said he hadn't known it would go this far. He said Carol had presented it as a framework, an informal discussion, not a real plan. He said he should have told me. He said he was sorry, and he said it in several different registers. Sorry, I upset you. Sorry, I didn't tell you. And finally, in the last message, something quieter and more specific. I'm sorry I let her make me someone I don't recognize. I'm sorry you had to see that. I sat with that last message for a long time. It was the only one that sounded like the man I had married. It was also, I understood then, not sufficient. Daniel came to my parents' house that evening. He was a trim, careful man with reading glasses he kept on a cord around his neck, and he sat at the dining room table with the envelope open in front of him and went through both documents with the focused, diagnostic attention of someone who has seen many versions of a bad idea. When he finished, he looked up and folded his glasses and said, "The document isn't signed, which is in your favor, but the fact that it was drafted with legal assistance and that it specifically references your salary and your assets establishes intent. The question is what you want to do with that." "What are my options?" I asked. He listed them. I could ignore it, which he did not recommend. I could confront Carol directly with legal representation present, which he did recommend if I wanted a clear record. I could begin formal separation proceedings, which would trigger automatic financial disclosures and protect my assets. Or I could do what he called the quiet version, document everything, say nothing, and build a complete picture before moving. The quiet version takes longer, he said, but it tends to produce better outcomes when the other side doesn't know you're preparing. I chose the quiet version. For 3 weeks, I was very calm. I returned to the house. I was civil to Jason, carefully and precisely civil, in the way that is its own kind of message. I resumed normal life on the surface, went to work, cooked dinner, responded to texts, and beneath that surface, I was building something with the same focus I had brought to every hard thing I had ever done. I met with Daniel twice. I opened a personal account at a bank Carol had no connection to and transferred my direct deposit. I had a quiet conversation with my HR department about updating my financial emergency contacts and benefits beneficiaries, framed as routine housekeeping. I scanned every document in the filing cabinet in the home office and emailed the files to Daniel. And among them, I found 3 things I had not been looking for. A printed email exchange between Jason and Carol dated 5 weeks before the promotion was announced, in which Carol described her plan in considerably more direct language than the spreadsheet had used. A handwritten note from Carol with figures that matched my previous year's bonus exactly. Figures Jason could only have provided to her, and a draft of a second document, this one unsigned, that I did not fully understand until Daniel read it and told me very carefully that it appeared to be a preliminary inquiry about adding Carol as a co-borrower on the mortgage. I sat very still for a long time after he told me that. She was going to try to put herself on my mortgage, I said. Based on this document, it appears that was a future step in the plan, Daniel said. Your husband would have needed to sign alongside you for any such change to proceed. His name isn't on the current mortgage, but as your spouse, his cooperation would have been necessary to initiate certain processes. He paused. It's worth noting that the email exchange suggests he was aware of this phase of the plan. He knew she wanted to get onto my mortgage. The language is ambiguous enough to argue, Daniel said. But yes, I think he knew. I drove home in the dark and sat in my car in the driveway for a long time, looking at the lit windows of the house I had bought, the warm light falling through the curtains I had chosen. I thought about the morning I had stood at the kitchen counter and thought, I built this. And I had. Everything in that house was mine. The work that paid for it, the hands that had repaired it, the love I had poured into its ordinary mornings and quiet evenings, and the people I had trusted most had been, for months, working methodically to redirect the fruits of that work to themselves. The knowledge of it sat in my chest like something calcified, past the point of pain, compressed into something dense and permanent and clarifying. I went inside. Jason was in the living room. He looked up when I came in, and whatever he saw in my face made him put his phone down very slowly, the way you put things down when you want to have both hands free. "We need to talk," I said. I told him what I had found. I told him about the email chain, about Carol's figures matching my bonus, about the draft mortgage document. I told him quietly, sitting across the room from him, watching his face as each piece of information landed. He did not deny the emails. He said he hadn't known about the mortgage document. And I watched him say it, and I could not tell with any certainty whether that was true. And the fact that I could not tell was itself a kind of answer. He said Carol had moved further than he had expected. He said he had been trying to manage her. He said, and here his voice broke slightly in a way that might have undone me 3 weeks earlier, that he had been afraid to tell me because he knew what it would mean. "I was scared of losing you," he said, "so I kept telling myself it would stop, that she would drop it." "You were scared of losing me," I said, "so you let her build a plan to take my money." He had nothing to say to that. The silence lasted a long time, and in it I could hear the refrigerator running and the settling of the house around us and the particular quality of quiet that exists between two people who have arrived somewhere they cannot come back from. He knew it. I could see it in his face, not the panic denial of someone fighting for a version of events, but the exhausted recognition of someone who has run out of versions. "I need you to understand something," I said. I kept my voice very level, very quiet, because the quieter I was, the more he could hear me. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not your mother getting carried away. This was a plan. It was documented, it was lawyered, and you were part of it for months. Whatever you told yourself to make it feel like less than that, it was a plan. I stood up. "I'm asking you to move out this week. I'm not asking you to disappear. I'm asking for space to understand what comes next, but you do not stay in this house while I figure that out." He left on a Saturday. Carol called me that afternoon, directly, for the first time, rather than routing everything through Jason. Her voice, when I answered, was different from any register I had heard her use before. The warmth was gone entirely, and what remained was something harder and more honest, which I found, strangely, easier to deal with. "I hope you understand," she said, "that Jason is not going to be able to sustain himself financially without some structure in place. He has given years to this relationship." "Carol," I said, "I'm going to stop you there. My attorney has the emails. He has the draft documents. He has a record of every step of what you've been building since October. If you, or anyone acting on your behalf, takes any further steps related to my finances, my property, or my professional life, that record goes to the relevant parties, and we stop having conversations and start having legal proceedings. Do you understand me?" There was a silence. Then, "You're being very dramatic." "I'm being very clear," I said. "There's a difference." And I ended the call and put my phone face down on the kitchen counter and stood very still for a moment. And then I turned on the kettle for tea and looked out the window at the bare apple tree and the flat December sky, and I breathed, slowly in and out, in the house that was mine. Daniel sent a formal letter to Gerald's office the following week, documenting the attempt and making explicit what the consequences of further action would be. Gerald, to his credit, responded within 2 days with a brief, carefully worded note that communicated, without quite saying so, that he had advised his client to drop the matter. Carol went quiet. Jason and I began the slow, grinding work of figuring out what, if anything, remained of our marriage, a process I will not compress into a neat summary, because it deserved more than that. What I will say is that we saw a counselor, and that the counselor was good, and that some things were reconstructed with effort, and some things were not reconstructible, and that Jason, over the following months, did work that I respected, and that respect and love are not the same thing, and sometimes love is not enough to hold a shape once the structure beneath it has been examined and found to be different from what you believed. By the following spring, I was living alone in my house. The divorce was uncontested. The settlement was straightforward, because the financial records were clear and the legal situation was straightforward. The house was mine alone, had always been mine alone, and remained mine. Jason kept his equipment and his savings. We were civil. We are still civil. Carol and I have not spoken since that phone call. It is late spring now, and the apple tree in my backyard is in full bloom. White flowers dense along every branch, petals falling in slow drifts when the wind moves through. I drink my coffee at the kitchen counter in the mornings the same way I always have. 2 scoops, French press, 4 minutes. And the light comes through the east window and pools on the oak floors in the same amber rectangles. The house is the same house. The coffee is the same coffee. The light is the same light. And I am not the same person. I know things now that I did not know that October morning when I stood here laughing in mismatched socks, full of uncomplicated joy. I know that love requires examination, not just feeling. I know that generosity given without awareness of where it lands is not virtue, but exposure. I know that when someone shows you what they are willing to build in secret, you should believe what they have shown you, even when it costs you something you treasured. I lost a marriage. I lost the version of Jason I thought I knew. I lost the luxury of trusting without looking. Those are real losses, and I do not minimize them. But I kept the house. I kept the career I built. I kept the life I constructed from 6 years of early mornings and deliberate effort and the particular stubbornness of someone who has never been given anything and knows exactly what things cost. And I kept myself, which is, when everything else is tallied, the only thing that was never negotiable. The apple tree drops another handful of petals onto the grass. Somewhere in the neighborhood, a door opens and closes. The coffee is exactly right. I built this.